We will see, how we go, and I will go very slow so that you can reflect on the ideas that I'm presenting, and I'm also, I will also make my best efforts to explain. So at least you can make some sort of connection to the topic, to the concepts, and also to the context. Okay, so with that, maybe you have already taken a look at the title. World English is from the perspective of languages situated practice, examining English textbooks in Bangladesh. Definitely you are familiar with English language textbooks in Bangladesh. I can take that for granted. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about World Englishes. I will explain that. And perhaps something that is probably distant is what is called language as situated practice. Okay, so if you deconstruct the title of the talk, you can actually identify three keywords, textbooks that we are all more or less familiar with. And textbooks are generally considered pedagogical resources. So these are resources for teaching and learning. So textbooks give us the pedagogical input. So this is the means for engagement and interaction between teachers and students. So that is what we know about textbooks. And then one big idea is World Englishes. Our Dean Sir and also the Honorable Vice Chancellor have already referred to the transformation of English, or you can call it the changing faces of English, how British English has been transformed into many different varieties, both native varieties of Englishes like American English and Australian English, and also the non-native varieties. So we will talk about that, World Englishes. And the third keyword is language as situated practice. Okay, and before I move on, let me explain these three concepts so that you can have at least some understanding to connect to the topic that we have for today. So, thinking about the English language textbooks, traditionally, textbooks for English language teaching and learning have been published in the West, published by Western publishers like Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, Pearson, and other Western publishers. So they publish the textbooks. So-called non-English speaking countries usually buy the books from them. If you are a rich country, then you can order a particular publisher to produce textbooks for a particular education system. So for example, an international publisher may produce textbooks for Japanese students, let's say at the school level or at the university level. So yeah, traditionally we have, we can locate English language textbooks in the West, published by Western publishers. Because these books are published in the West, there are many questions, there are many issues, and one of the key issues that scholars and researchers have pointed out is about the question of cultural representation. How different countries, different cultures, and different languages are represented in these textbooks that are published in the West. So cultural inappropriateness has been one of the key issues. Maybe a particular culture will be presented in a particular way, in a reductionist way, or perhaps in an inappropriate way, or in some cases in an unacceptable way, because the books are published in the West. So that's one of the key issues. That's not the only issue though. Because the books are published in the West by Western publishers, these resources have ensured the hegemony of native Englishes, native varieties of Englishes, and also their speakers. So if you look at any textbook published in the West by a Western publisher, you can see lots of references to native Englishes as the target for our students, for our teachers. We can also see references to native speakers. So native speakers are sort of idealized as our targets for teaching and learning. So you can see the hegemony there. Okay, the question that we need to ask in our context, in the global south, if you like, what happens to textbooks when we actually produce them on our own, when these textbooks are produced locally? We are not borrowing from, we are not buying from the market, from the Western publishers. We are actually producing our own textbooks. So that's one of the questions that I'm really interested in asking. Okay, and so this presentation is some way or the other related to this question. What happens to textbooks? What happens to Englishes? What happens to the question of culture when we are producing our own books, when we are not borrowing them from the global market, if you like? Okay, the second key word, as I pointed out, is world Englishes. I can talk about world Englishes for hours because this is a very interesting area for me. I have written a lot on this particular topic. At the moment, there is an encyclopedia that is being produced. It's called Encyclopedia of World Englishes. So I have written for that encyclopedia as well. So yeah, I'm really interested in it. And here in this slide, I have pointed out some key arguments or features about world Englishes. So hopefully it will give us some understanding of what do we mean by world Englishes. So world Englishes is presented as a new paradigm in our understanding of English. This is a new way of understanding the English language. Okay, so the argument here is there are actually many Englishes in the world, not just one English, not just one variety of English, not just native or American English. There are other Englishes in the world. So we talk about Singapore English, we talk about Malaysian English, Indian English, and why not about Bangladeshi English as well? Okay, so at least a couple of publications that we have made have the title Bangladeshi English. Okay, and if you have many Englishes, then obviously a follow-up, an essential follow-up is there will be multiple norms or many standards. Okay, so that's one of the key arguments. And this particular paradigm, making an argument for recognition of many Englishes in the world, multiple Englishes in the world, this is actually related to the question of linguistic equality and at the same time linguistic ownership. So with the globalization of English, now that English has spread in many parts of the world, we need to think about who owns the language. Does it belong to the native speakers, or should it belong to us as well? Can we claim the English language to be our own language as well, like the British or the American, for example? Okay, and then related to that, there is also the question of linguistic justice. Okay, so you can see this is actually a movement in the right direction, because at the heart of this movement, there are these very fundamental kinds of arguments that we need to have equality, we need to have justice when we talk about English, when we talk about English in the world. So this particular paradigm, that is world Englishes, argues for the recognition of non-native Englishes. Okay, our ways of English language, our purposes of using the language will be different from the way the English language is used in other parts of the world. Whether we talk about what is called the inner circle or the outer circle or the external or the expanding circle countries, for example. So it's an argument for inclusiveness. So we have recognized, other native varieties of Englishes, like, alongside British English, we consider American English and Australian English as sort of valid or legitimate varieties, then what is wrong about Indian English, for example, or Singapore English or Malaysian English, for example? So the basic argument in this particular paradigm is related to linguistic pluralism, not linguistic singularism. So it's an argument for recognizing all the different varieties of Englishes in the world. It is also a recognition of linguistic creativity. Okay, if native speakers of English can create new words, new ideas, new terms, why can't we do it? We can also do it. There has to be recognition. Our creativity should also be recognized. And also at the same time, we also need to recognize local standards, because we are using English for our own purposes, for our own, to talk about our own realities and our identities, for example. So we need to think about local standards. Okay, so that's briefly the second keyword as part of the title, World Englishes. Okay, but of course, like any theory, there are lots of criticisms of this particular paradigm that is called World Englishes. Some scholars have argued that in talking about World Englishes, we are actually reimposing what is called linguistic borders or boundaries in language use. So for example, when you are talking about Bangladeshi English or Indian English or Singapore English, you are kind of creating boxes of English. This is Indian English, Malaysian English, Bangladeshi English. So some scholars are critical of this, framing or boxing or fitting English into national territories, if you like. So that's one of the lines of criticisms of this particular paradigm. Other scholars have also referred to what is called English-only monolingualism. Okay, so for example, they argue that in a way, this is actually not recognizing multilingualism or linguistic diversity, because we are still talking about English only. When we are talking about, in a way, we are recognizing how people use English in different parts of the world, but at the same time, we are sort of ignoring other languages or multilingualism. So that's another criticism that we have about World Englishes, for example. So other arguments, other criticisms of this particular paradigm refer to the ignorance of what is called linguistic dynamism. So again, I just mentioned the linguistic boxing, putting languages into sort of national territories, but languages are actually more fluid, more dynamic. These are, we can see sort of language can be mobile. People can actually move beyond, they can travel, between different circles, different territories. So if you are talking about Indian English, for example, or Bangladeshi English, in a way, you are actually indicating language territory connection. But in reality, we always sort of overcome, we go beyond the territory. People always move, they always move beyond their territory. So in that sense, if you are talking about Indian English or Bangladeshi English, in a way you are sort of denying this linguistic dynamism. So that's another criticism that we have for World English's paradigm, for example. Okay, and then the third keyword that we have in the title, this is probably something more unfamiliar to the audience here, and this is called language as situated practice. No matter how it sounds to you, it's actually a very simple concept. The basic idea is, here, when we talk about language as situated practice, we are actually talking about language as it is used on the ground. Language as it is used by people in different situations. In other words, instead of looking at language as a system, we are talking about, we want to see how people are actually using the language in different situations, in different contexts. So this is, for example, these two scholars, Heller and Morag, they talk about locally occasion talk and text. So, in our case, we'll be talking about textbook in particular. So we are talking about local production of text and talk and text. So we are not talking about the sort of systemic view of the language. We are talking about languages that are practiced in reality, languages that reflect the on-the-ground reality, if you like. Okay, so this is not a systemic view, but this is a view that considers language as practice. So another scholar, Monica Heller, she also gives us a more detailed understanding of this particular view of language. Language as a set of ideologically defined resources and practices that constructs language as fundamentally a social phenomena. So language is not a system, language not as the dictionary, but as practices. What people do with language, how people use the language in real life. So that's what we understand by language as situated practice. Okay, so in a way, one of the arguments that I have been making in my research is, okay, so given the different criticisms that we have of world Englishes, the point that, okay, it's a way of boxing language or fitting language into sort of territory, the argument that I'm making is, if we take a situated view of language as situated practice, then we can actually ignore that. We can just focus on what is happening to language as people use it in different areas, whether we talk about the textbook, whether we talk about the classroom, whether we talk about other places where people are using English. That will give us an understanding of language, because here we are actually coming sort of free and open. We are not bringing any particular framework. We just want to see how people are using English, for example, in different situations. So given these three key ideas that I have presented for you, I'm interested in exploring some related questions. Questions like, what does English look like in local practice? So if we are informed by language and as situated practice, then we need to understand, so what is happening to language? What is happening to English, for example, in the textbook? So this is a grounded view. We are not talking about top-down kind of view. We want to see how the writers in the local textbook, how they're using the language. Are they drawing on sort of native varieties of Englishes, British English, American English, or are they creating a new kind of English, for example, that reflect the reality locally, for example? So that's an important question. Similarly, another question is, what can a grounded view tell us about language in education? So particularly, I'm interested in understanding what is happening to English in the education domain. And in this presentation, I'll be talking about textbook in particular, but of course, we can think about other areas of education as well. So for example, what is happening to the English language in the assessment system? What is happening to the language in the classroom, for example? Okay, and then perhaps more importantly, another question that we have is, how and for what purposes is English used in local contexts? So how is the English language used? What is the nature of the language, for example? What are the different reasons? What are the different purposes for which English is used in local textbook, for example? So remember, we are talking about local production of textbook. When we looked at textbooks that were produced in the West, there were many issues. And as I pointed out, there were issues around cultural representation. There were issues around the hegemony of native Englishes and native speakers. But we are talking about local productions. So what is happening to the English language? What are the different functions that we are actually performing by using the language, what kind of English we are using. So these are interesting questions for us to look at when we consider local English textbooks, particularly when we are taking this world English perspective, particularly when we are looking at it as from the perspective of languages situated practice. Okay, so how well am I going? Can you follow me? You understand? Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Let me drink, please allow me to drink some water. Okay, so given these questions, there will be an important methodological question. So how am I going to explore these questions? How am I going to find out, what is the nature of English in the textbook? What are the different functions of the textbook, for example? Okay, so these are methodological questions, and I can briefly tell you about how I am doing this kind of work. So basically, this is the methodology that is used for this kind of work is textbook analysis. Textbook analysis can follow both quantitative and qualitative approach. I'm more interested in qualitative kind of approach. Developing a particular kind of framework that will allow you to explore the question that you are interested in. And for this particular work, I'm looking at textbooks from year 1 to year 10 level. So both primary and the secondary, but of course not the higher secondary, that means year 11 and 12. That is not part of the analysis in this presentation. Okay, and probably you know that the English textbooks that we have produced by the NCTB, NCTB, National Curriculum and Textbook Board. Since 2015, the same textbooks that are used in the national curriculum in the mainstream schools, these textbooks are also used in madrasa education. Do you know that? Yes. You don't? Okay, maybe some of you know. So can you see any challenge here? Is it possible to use a set of textbooks that are originally produced for mainstream secular education, for the religious education?
As far as I have observed, for the book for the madrasa education, there is no pictures, human picture.
Okay.
Or picture is there or something like
okay,
that.
Okay.
But
Okay.
the content is so general that they also.
Okay. Okay. So definitely that's an educational challenge. It is also a social challenge. It is also a political challenge. How do you use a textbooks, a set of books that are produced for one stream of education for another stream? Can you just use them as you use them in the mainstream education, for example? So we will see how these challenges are addressed. Okay, so I looked at all the textbook, read them very closely, repeatedly reading them, taking notes, classifying forms and functions of English. So how the English language is used, for example, what are the different forms, and I'll give you examples. What are the different functions of the language, for example, in these textbooks? Okay, and I've also developed a framework for the analysis, which will help me to answer some of the questions that I'm really interested in. Okay, so for my analysis, as I said, I developed a framework, and this framework has got 3 components. The first one is about the nature of language use. And when I say nature of language use, I'm mainly talking about the nature of English language use, how the English language is deployed or applied in the textbooks. Okay, of course, English is the main focus, but as you will see, English is not the only language. There is also room for other languages, for example. So nature of language use is the first part of the analysis as part of the analytical framework. The second one is language functions. Okay, what are the different functions of English in the textbook? What are the different roles that are given to English? What are the functional expectations of the English language in the textbook? Okay, and then the third focus of the analysis of the framework is features of English. What are the different characteristics of English language that we can see and note in the textbooks that we have produced by the NCTB for our education system, for example. Okay, so let me give you examples of these three features of three components of the framework. The first one is the nature of language use. Okay, based on my analysis, I would argue that even though these are English language textbooks, we don't have just one variety of English or one particular language. Instead, it is possible to argue that we actually have an assemblage of varieties of Englishes. So it's not just local English. You can also see examples of British English, for example, because there will be some texts that are taken from the internet. There will be texts taken from other sources, maybe from which are related to the British English. So in that sense, we can see the assemblage of varieties of Englishes, multiple Englishes, multiple varieties of Englishes. We can see that in the textbook that I have analyzed. Okay, another interesting finding related to the nature of language use is the multimodality and hybridity of text. So you can see, it's not all